Good to see everybody that's made it out this evening. We're going to be continuing our Old Testament study, and we're going to be looking at the book of Esther this evening. It's a very interesting book, and wasn't intended, but it is befitting, again, I guess, for Mother's Day. Esther wasn't a mother that we see in this story, but she was a very, very important figure, very important woman figure in the Old Testament. And she played a very crucial role in the preservation of her people, and we'll study that and see that this evening. Just a quick background, though, before we get started. So the time of history right now is during the captivity to return transition period. As you see right here on the timeline, the return from Babylon, the first wave came in 538 BC, and that's when the Medo-Persian Empire conquered the Babylonian Empire, which originally captured the tribes of Judah and Benjamin there. And we see that as King Cyrus of Persia conquered Babylon, within his first year, he made a decree for the Jews to return back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And that was done. The temple was they returned in 538 BC, and then the temple was completed around 516 BC, so about 22 years there. Then the second wave with Ezra and some others, that was around 460 BC, and then the third wave, I believe, was Nehemiah's return there too, and he was included in that. So the story of Esther falls somewhere believed to be between 483 and 474 BC, so it was right in between the first and second returns there. All right, so we got some of the background going on there. The prime characters in the story, of course, King Ahasuerus. This is the king of the Medo-Persian Empire at the time. This is also referred to as King Xerxes in other areas. He reigned from 486 to 465 BC, and his wife, of course, was Queen Vashti. We'll read about her. Esther, the title of the book. She was a Jewish woman from the tribe of Benjamin. Her parents had both passed away, and she was actually raised an orphan from her kinsman Mordecai. Mordecai was, well, it's kind of I don't know how to put this in cousin language, but the kinsman of Esther was Mordecai's uncle's daughter. So if you know what that means, you can tell me after church, but I'm not wise enough to interpret that, but nonetheless, they're kinsmen. Mordecai is said to have sat at the gate of the king, and I believe that's basically he was somewhat as a doorkeeper to the court, something similar to that. So that type of role that he played there in Shushan. And then Haman, he is the perpetrator, the evil villain of the story. He is a second in line basically to the king. He's over all the other princes of Persia and Media, and like I said, he's basically second in power to the king. And he was a big time hater of the Jews, prominently Mordecai. He could not stand Mordecai, and he will be the trouble throughout the story. So now that we have these characters, I always think that's helpful when you're going through a story, especially if we're doing a lot of reading. You forget who's who and that type of thing. So if you got a question, you can look back up here and see who's who. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and start reading. We're going to read a significant amount just to cover this story, because you can't really, well, it's fitting to tell the whole story. We're not going to read every chapter or every verse by any means, but we are going to cover a fair amount of reading this evening. So I would encourage you to open up your Bibles and keep with me. Well, we'll start there at Esther chapter 1, starting at verse 1. So this is where the King Ahasuerus basically threw a big party to celebrate his kingdom and his wealth and his prestige. So Esther 1, verse 1. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this was the Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. In those days when King Ahasuerus sat at the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan the citadel, that in the third year of his reign he made a feast for all of his officials and servants, the powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being before him, when he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all that he had this look at this party. Everybody's there observing how great the kingdom was. And when these days were completed, the king made a feast lasting 7 days for all the people who were present in Shushan the citadel, from great to small, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. And there were white and blue linen curtains fastened with cords of fine linen and purple on silver rods and marble pillars. That's pretty impressive, the things that they have here. I'll read that again. There were white and blue linen curtains fastened with cords of fine linen and purple on silver rods and marble pillars, and the couches were of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of alabaster, turquoise, and black and white marble. And they served drinks in golden vessels, each vessel being different from the other, with royal wine in abundance, according to the generosity of the king. In accordance with the law, the drinking was not compulsory, for the king had ordered all the officers of his household that they should do according to each man's pleasure. So we can see here the wine was flowing, the drinks were plenty, and everybody was to be enjoying themselves. And now we come to Vashti. Verse 9. Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. And on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethra, and Carcass, 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing her royal crown, in order to show her beauty to the people and the officials, for she was beautiful to behold. But Vashti refused to come at the king's command brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. Now I didn't sit down and study this specific section very significantly to say, did she refuse to come because basically he was trying to show her off and that type of thing, and it was just this drunk party and she was refusing to degrade herself, or was it simply a matter of rebellion? I don't know, but regardless, she refused to do so, and that, of course, infuriated the king, and he seeks counsel from his best wise men as to what are we going to do about this. And we see that there in verse 16 of chapter 1, and there we'll pick up. And Memucan answered before the king and the princes, who was his chief advisor, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king, but also all the princes and all the people who were in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will become known to all women, so that they will despise their husbands in their eyes when they report. King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought in before him, but she did not come. This very day the noble ladies of Persia and Media will say to all the king's officials that they have heard of the behavior of the queen. Thus there will be excessive contempt and wrath. If it pleases the king, let a royal decree go out from him, and let it be recorded in the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it will not be altered, that Vashti shall come no more before King Ahasuerus. And let the king give a royal position to another who is better than she. So now they search for a new queen. We'll pick up there in chapter 2. After these things, the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, but he remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. And the king's servants who attended him said, Let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom, that they may gather all the beautiful young virgins to Shushan the citadel into the women's quarters under the custody of Haggai the king's eunuch, custodian of the women, and let preparations be given to them. And this pleased the king, and he said, let's do it. So that's the plan that they enacted to replace Queen Vashti for her refusal to obey his request there. And now we're going to be introduced to Esther, and there in verse 5, beginning back at verse 5. So in Shushan the citadel there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjaminite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been carried with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So it was when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Shushan the citadel under the custody of Haggai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace into the care of Haggai, the custodian of the women. Now the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor, so he readily gave beauty preparations to her, besides her allowance. And 7 choice maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place of the house of women. And Esther had not, this is important here, verse 10. Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her. So he did warn her not to let anyone know that she was a Jew, and kind of disclosed that. And he kept it silent. But he, as you can see, he was very concerned for her, and he was checking up on her every day there. Let's skip on down to verse 15. And this is when she comes before the king. Now, when the turn came for Esther and the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, to go into the king, she requested nothing but what Haggai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of women, advised. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So here we see how Esther became the queen. She found great favor before the king there. And that's that for now. Let's go on just a little bit further in the chapter. And there's an important part we're going to look at. And this is where Mordecai, Esther's kinsman, basically saves a plot to kill the king. And he basically saves the king's life in a sense. So Esther 2, starting at verse 21, it says, "In those days, while Mordecai sat within the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, the doorkeepers, became furious and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. So the matter became known to Mordecai, and he told Queen Esther. And Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name, and when an inquiry was made into the matter, it was confirmed, and both were hanged on a gallows. And it was written in the book of Chronicles in the presence of the king." And that will become a very valuable piece of evidence that we'll run into later on in the story. And now we'll get introduced to Haman. I believe everybody else on the board has been introduced here. So beginning at chapter 3, verse 1. "So after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow down or pay homage. And then the king's servants who were within the king's gate said to Mordecai, 'Why do you transgress the king's command?' Now it happened when they spoke to him daily that he would not listen to them, and they told it to Haman to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for Mordecai had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay him homage, Haman was filled with wrath, but his disdain to lay hands on Mordecai, but he disdained, start over at verse 6. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. So instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. So because of his hatred for the Jews, he decided he would devise a plan, and primarily because he hated Mordecai and his lack of reverence, and he understood that the Jewish people would not bow down and would not worship a man, would not pay him reverence. Mordecai apparently made that plain, that he was not going to bow down and bow the knee to Mordecai. He was just a mere man. And I'm sure that he gathered that as he was a Jew, that the rest of the Jews, of course, any devout Jew was going to do likewise. They weren't going to give him that level of reverence, and he did not like that one bit. So instead of just wanting to get rid of Mordecai, he decides he's going to kill the entire Jewish population that's in the kingdom here. So he goes before the king with a false charge that the entire population of Jews did not obey the laws and commands of the kingdom, and because of this, they needed to be ridden of. And we'll pick up there at Esther 3, verse 8. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There's a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. If it please the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work, to bring it into the king's treasuries. So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the money and the people are given to you. Do with them as seems good to you. So Haman basically calls Congress into session here, and they draft up this document and send it out among all the provinces there, the plan to destroy the Jews. Picking back up at verse 13. And the letters were sent by couriers into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their possessions. A copy of that document was to be issued as law in every province, being published for all the people, that they should be ready for that day. The couriers went out, hastened by the king's command, and the decree was proclaimed in Shushan the citadel. So the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was perplexed. When they got the decree, I think they were kind of taken back, and they didn't see what Haman painted a picture of up to the king. So it seemed like probably the civilians in general were kind of in shock of that decree, just as well as the Jews were. So as I said, the letters went out, and the Jews were definitely very, very fearful of what was planned for them. And when Mordecai heard the decree, he began to mourn in sackcloth and ashes, and he was so greatly distressed that Esther couldn't console him. She attempted to reach out to him, and he would not be comforted. And it seems, as reading through there, maybe Esther at that point had not yet heard of the decree. So Mordecai gets a copy of the letter through her. He obtains a copy of the letter and sends it back through her messenger so that she could read the decree and see for herself what Haman had devised for the Jews. And after reading this, she sent back word to Mordecai, because I think she immediately understood her responsibility, but the roadblock that was in her way is what we're going to see here. So Esther 4, starting at verse 10. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a command for Mordecai. That's just the messenger Hathach there. And all the king's servants and all the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king, who has not been called, he has but one law, put all to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called into the king these 30 days. So I think she understands her responsibility to go to the king and to try to change this, but at the same time, she's also faced with a potential, a suicide mission, just approaching the king without being summoned. If she goes before the king and he refuses to hold out the scepter to acknowledge her and allow her to come, then they're going to kill her right there on the spot. So she's in a tough situation. Picking up verse 12. So they told Mordecai Esther's words, and Mordecai told them to answer Esther. Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, Go, gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me, neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther commanded him. So she was most certainly concerned about her people and also her own well-being, but she chose the better part and decided that she would be willing to risk her life to go before the king unannounced to hopefully save her people. And she prepares to do that. She requests that all of the Jews there fast for 3 days and 3 nights, and she will do the same. And we'll pick up there. So after the fasting, Esther gets ready and decides to follow through with her plan. She comes before the king unannounced, and right away he holds out the scepter, allows her in, and greets her graciously. So that part is out of the way. She's safe, and upon entering, the king welcomes her, and he says, what's your request? I'll give you up to half the kingdom. He loves Esther. He thinks highly of her. And she requests that Haman and himself come to a banquet for her, the following day or that evening. I think that evening, yeah. So the king, he accepts and gladly comes. He calls for Haman, and the two of them come to her banquet that she prepares. And not really much happens at this banquet. They dine and all, and then the king asks her once more, well, what's your request? Up to half the kingdom, I'm willing to help do whatever for you. And she then requests a banquet the following day, so a second banquet for Haman, the king, and herself privately again. And the king accepts, and they go on there. And here we pick up at Esther 5, verse 9. So Haman went out that day joyful with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gates, and that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told them of his great riches, the multitude of his children, everything in which the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and servants of the king. And moreover, Haman said, besides, Queen Esther invited no one but me to come in with the king to the banquet that she prepared. Tomorrow I am again invited by her along with the king. Yet all this avails me nothing, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows be made 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman so that he had the gallows made. So basically, Haman goes home that evening after the first banquet, just walking on clouds, all but the exception of crossing paths with Mordecai. And of course, he didn't bow before him, and that just hurt his feelings. And he moped on home and basically called his friends together, and everything's great in my life. He's promoted above everybody. He's doing so good, but this one thing just keeps digging at him, and that's Mordecai. And he can't enjoy his cake because of him. So his wife and his friends said, just kill him, They tell him to build a big platform, set up some nooses, or set up a noose, I guess. And the next day, just go to the king and say, hey, let's kill this guy. And then you can go to your banquet and enjoy life. And of course, that sounded great to Haman. And that's what he plans to do. But here's where I think things get God is involved throughout all of this, but I think some really important things happen right here outside of anyone's control. So that night, the king couldn't sleep, and he was troubled, and he was tossing and turning. So he has one of his servants read the chronicles of history of the kingdom there, and they come to the part where Mordecai had foiled an assassination attempt on the king, and he gets to thinking about that, and he said, what was ever done for this man? What did we ever do for him? They said, well, nothing, So he decides that needed to be changed, and so the next morning there, he's thinking about this, and Haman comes walking by. So he's like, Haman, come here. And he asked him what would be fitting to honor the man who let me get back to my notes. I'm just mumbling now. So it was right about that time that Haman was passing through, and he was specifically coming to request the death of Mordecai. And the king calls and asks for his advice. And we'll pick up there at Esther 6, verse 6. So Haman came in, and the king asked him, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? So, of course, Haman is like, oh, yeah, this is me. Now Haman thought in his heart, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? And Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let a royal robe be brought which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. Then let his robe and horse be delivered to the hand of the one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, thus it shall be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robe and the horse as you have suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits within the king's gate. Leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken. So that's like the most ironic, poetic justice that could be done right there. Exactly what he wanted done for himself, he had to do to his ultimate worst enemy. Nothing could have been more embarrassing or degrading for him than to do that. I'm sure he just wanted to die when he was told to do that. But he does, as was commanded. He paraded him around and honored him and all that. I'm sure he was sore to look at, but he did it. And he tucked his tail between his legs and went home that evening, back to his friends and wife, and same thing, told them all that had happened. And one of his wise men says this, back at verse 13. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men and his wife said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him." Seems like newfound news to them also. And while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared. So he got home, moped around for a minute, and no sooner than that, he had to go back to this banquet. So I'm sure he's still kind of in poor spirits, but maybe this excited him a little bit, I don't know. And so he rushes off to this second banquet that he had been looking forward to. And we'll pick up there. We're going to read the entirety of chapter 7, which is 10 verses, but I'm not going to summarize it any better, so we're just going to read it. So Esther chapter 7, verse 1. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther, and on the second day at the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request up to half the kingdom? It shall be done." And Queen Esther answered and said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss." So King Ahasuerus answered and said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he? Who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing?" And Esther said, "The adversary and enemy is the wicked Haman." So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. There he sits, just those three. Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. And when the king returned from the palace garden from the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. Then the king said, "Will he assault the queen while I'm in the house?" As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Now Harbona, one of the eunuchs, said to the king, "Look, the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman." Then the king said, "Hang him on it." So they hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. And then the king's wrath subsided. So here we see that Esther, for the first time, revealed her identity to the king. Before that, he had not known that she was a Jew. And really, nor did he I don't know that he even knew the group of people who Haman desired to kill. He just described them, and he said they need to be gone. And once he learns this, he's outraged. And once he realizes that was what had happened, what had taken place, that Haman had planned to do this, he became greatly angry, and he actually left the room. I don't know, to cool off or what, but he was very furious, went to his palace garden. And when he came back, Haman was there begging Esther, to spare his life and all this stuff, and he had actually fallen over her. And when the king came in, that's what he saw. So that really made it bad. And one of the king's eunuchs was like, "Hey, he had just made this platform to hang Mordecai on. Why don't we do that?" And he said, "Go and do it." And so Haman is killed, and he's sentenced to death and hanged on the very gallows that he had constructed for Mordecai. Once more, there's a really ironic twist to that whole plot there. It couldn't be, honestly, any better justice delegated to Haman and that plan. And so in the following chapters, we see Esther once more come before the king and request to repeal the order to annihilate the Jews. And King Ahasuerus consented, and he repealed that order. And he allowed for the exact opposite. Said that anyone who basically attacks the Jews on this day, he gives the Jews full permission to annihilate, to kill, and to return and to avenge themselves for any evil done upon them on that same day that the proclamation was originally dated for. That had to be a weird feeling, for the Jews, because they were aware of that this was going to happen on a certain day, and here they are between now and then. They're not being harmed, they're not being done wrong, but they knew that day was coming where whoever they decided, whatever group was going to attack and do their best to kill every last one of them. And to be given that opportunity to say no instead, anybody that comes at you, take care of them, and then they did just that. And they killed many adversaries on that day. And furthermore, Mordecai was brought to Haman's previous position. The lowly doorkeeper was brought up to second in command in the king's house there. He became a great man of authority in the kingdom. And that's all that we're going to look at in the book of Esther. It's a very important book. It's a book that we see, I guess, a lot of providential act of God. If you read through the entire book, God's name's not in it. It says nothing about God, but as you read through the book, you can't not see God working in the background. Esther was a humble Jewish orphan girl who rose to the queen's position. And things like that don't just happen by happenstance. And we see the tables completely turned for Haman and his plot to kill the Jews. We see Mordecai going from the lowly doorkeeper to second in the command of the kingdom. These things weren't by simple happenstance. There was some providential work of God going on here. I hope we see that. And I'm not saying the providence of God is very powerful, and it's always working. I think it's apparent in this book. I don't want to say that you can't just claim everything that happens good in your life is the providence of God. I'm not going by that at all. You have to be very careful to assume what is God's providential work. But I think it's very clear in this book that God was working to save His people. And another thing I think we can see is, Aaron made a point about this morning, and I totally agree with it, but we see the significance of one person's actions to play their role. As Aaron said, God saves the people. God saved the people. It wasn't Mordecai. It wasn't Esther specifically. The plan would have went through irregardless whether they had a part in it or not, but they were willing and they were in it, and they fulfilled. They got to contribute to the saving of their people because they were obedient and followed through overcoming the obstacles that were before them. When we go back to Esther 4, verses 13 and 14, I think it's very apparent there, and we see Mordecai's faith on this. It's going to happen. Basically, it's what he feels like. Esther 4, verse 13, and Mordecai told them to answer Esther. This is before she went to the king, when she was, I would say, nervous to approach the king before all this. And Mordecai told them to answer Esther, "Do not think that in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place." It's going to happen. God's going to take care of us. "But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" So you had an opportunity to become part of His plan. God uses the actions of men to carry out His will. I think we see that throughout the Old Testament. It's very apparent. God uses people, and it can be good or bad. But nonetheless, whether you commit to it and you involve yourself, you can step away from His plan, but His ultimate will is still going to be fulfilled, whether you're a part of it or not. But nonetheless, we see these Mordecai and Esther. They take their role, and they do it appropriately. And we all have similar opportunities to fulfill God's will in our lives. Each and every time we come across an opportunity, we can act one of two ways. We can take advantage of an opportunity, maybe to spread the gospel or to just help someone or anything like that. It's God's will that we do those type of things. We can be for Him, or we can take advantage of those opportunities, or we can shy away from them, unlike Esther, and Mordecai, and we can have, God's will still be accomplished, but you won't be a part of it. So we always have those opportunities, and we always need to be aware of that as we live our lives. So that's all I have for us this evening. I hope it's been a enjoyable study. I know that was a lot of reading. I hope I didn't go through it too fast or too hard to keep up with. But if you never obeyed the gospel, we'd like to give you an opportunity to do that at this time. If you've never submitted yourself to God and His will is that you would be saved. You can do that by being baptized for the remission of your sins. If you'd like to look into that further, we'd be more than happy to talk with you, to help you. Or if you have and you've sinned in some manner and that you need to make that right publicly, or you'd simply request the prayers of the church, we give you any of those opportunities while we stand and sing.
Thanks for watching this video. I know what you're thinking. I don't want to miss another video from this channel. In order to avoid that, click on the red button down there, subscribe, and then click the bell icon. Not only will that alert you each time a new video is uploaded to the channel, it will also help spread the channel to other people's awareness. So, go ahead, do it. Like right now, click on it.